Hi, this is Dr. Mark Sehl from the YouTube channel Therapy for the Heart. This is part 2 of On Choosing a Therapist. It will be part 2, perhaps part 3. We'll see how it goes. Last time I was mentioning about psychotherapy, and it's very confusing about who can practice what. So the best thing is to, whatever profession that person is holding out to you as they practice, psychotherapy, psychoanalysis, whatever, check the licensing in whatever state you reside in. And psychotherapy, for instance, in New York is not a licensed profession per se, but the people who practice it are licensed social workers, psychiatrists, mental health counselors, social workers with master's degrees, marriage and family therapists, whatever that person's training is in, you can check with their licensing board to see if they're licensed. That's the best way, not to take it from this video, because that's really not what I want to cover particularly. So in the first interview, what you want to know is if you feel understood and welcomed by the therapist. For instance, for the first time when I meet somebody, I don't buzz them into the waiting room because I don't want them to come in and figure out where they're supposed to go. Even though that might seem obvious to some people, but I come out for the first time, I come out to the door and greet them and invite them in to the waiting room and then come out and see them. When I see them, I don't offer to shake their hand because I don't know whether people want to be touched or not. So unless they offer their hand, then of course I'll shake their hand. Sometimes people continue to shake hands at the end of the session for me for the lifetime of the therapy, because that's what they do, is how they greet people in their culture. And some old analysts used to be analyzing people for that reason and thinking that, well, they're shaking their hand, for instance, to give an interpretation that they're being overly friendly to cover hostility. And things like that, interpretations like that, old guard psychoanalysts used to make, but they weren't very helpful. I don't think hopefully they don't make them anymore, because they put people on the spot and make them feel uncomfortable and that they did something wrong. And then the narcissistic defense comes into play, that there's something wrong with them. We've covered the narcissistic defense in many of the talks on therapy. So in the first contact, if the first contact is by email, did the therapist thank you for the email? Did the therapist try to accommodate you in terms of time? Now, sometimes that's not always possible because therapists have their full practice. They may not be able to give you a convenient time, but I think it's important to try to work something out with them if you can. If the therapist doesn't try, you might want to tuck that away as a possible sign of rigidity. Not definitely that, but possible. Did you feel understood in the first consultation? That's very important. If you don't feel understood, that's not a good sign. Were the questions helpful or were they invasive? Invasive questions are off-putting, and you really want to, when you're talking to a therapist, usually you open the door to a subject, and then they walk through that door, so they're invited. So I think that's very important, to stay with the person wherever they are at the moment, what they're talking about. And did you feel that the therapist understood why you were coming and what you wanted help with? That should be very clear during that consultation. Many people fear coming to therapy for the first time because they're afraid of being judged. They feel ashamed about being there, that they should be able to do it all on their own because that's the way they were brought up. So we as therapists sometimes forget how much anxiety is produced just by coming into that office. So we need to remember ourselves how it was when we went to therapy and how anxious it could have made us at the time. Remember, you are interviewing the therapist also. You both are thinking, excuse me, about how it's going to be to work together. And that's going to be a commitment that's often for quite some time. You are the consumer, you have a right. Like if you're going for a job, it shouldn't be going for a job hat in hand. If it's so, you need to build up your confidence to go there, that you know that you have a valuable service to provide that employer, as much as they're going to give you something, you're giving them something. So it's the same with therapy. You're going to hire somebody to do a job for you, and you want to make sure that they're the best person for you to do it. Sometimes you're asked on a consultation, or the observation is made that you're anxious. And I remember a supervisor I had one time that when I sat down in the first meeting, she said, "Mr. Sehl," she said, "why are you so nervous?" And I said, "Well, I didn't say anything. I left. I mean, I never came back. I was very young. I didn't have the gumption to say, well, do you know, when you ask me a question like that, it certainly doesn't help my anxiety one bit. It's really putting me off." And then if I said that, and then she said, well, you know, if she got defensive, I would know, hey, forget this. If she said, well, Mr. Sehl, I'm sorry I made you uncomfortable. Let me continue to work with you. I don't want to do that again. That would be different. Also, you want to know if you feel the therapist has been interested and been listening to you. For instance, maybe you're talking about school experiences in high school, college, what school was like, and as an aside, you might mention that you were uncomfortable with a particular school, and then you go on and talk about something else about school. So if the therapist goes back and says, by the way, at one point you said you weren't comfortable with that school. What was it about the school? And then you know that that therapist is really listening, really pays attention. And it might be a big deal about what was comfortable about that school. Maybe they didn't want to go to that school. Maybe they never had a choice to go to that school. You know, parents often don't give children a choice. Perhaps they can't, but I think it's always good to talk about it with children. And if you can give them a choice, it's a good idea. Did the therapist ask how it was to talk together? I like to get that feedback from the person because that helps me correct whatever errors I might make during the session, and I can make them if I don't know the person very well. So I like to get feedback. How was it to talk to me today? Patients will not, also what that does is it sets the stage for that person to let them know that you're interested in how they're experiencing the therapy along the way. Some people don't want to know. They don't want to feel criticized. Therapists often are very sensitive to criticism, believe it or not. I can be at times. There was a book on the analyst's narcissistic disturbance, The Gifted Child and the Analyst's Narcissistic Disturbance, a brilliant book, and by Alice Miller. And it talked about, you know, why therapists go into the profession in the first place, and because they have because the person is hanging on their every word. Now they're the center of attention, but also they don't want a patient to get angry with them, and that's quite a bind, right? I'm not saying that's typical of most analysts. There's a background noise here, so you can write in and complain to me about the background noise, but I can't do anything about it today. I want to get this finished so I can do another video. So, but yeah, Alice Miller's book, that was a good book. I use that in some of my papers, so if you ever get a copy of it. Did the therapist give you a feeling she was listening by giving you a summary at the end of what transpired and what you talked about? For instance, you might say to a patient who's been talking about depression that they've had all their life, you can say that, you know, you've come to me for therapy today and you've told me that you've been depressed all your life and how that depression has been interfering with your ability to work effectively and also with your relationships with people. And in that way they feel that you have paid attention to what they're trying to tell you during that session. The patient might ask, how often do I come for therapy? And I usually like to, there isn't any right answer to that question. I'd like to ask you as the audience, how often would you like to come to therapy? Supposing you said to me, I'd like to come once a month or twice a month. I might ask you, well, how long have you had this depression that you want to help with, or anxiety that you want help with it? If you tell me, well, you 1 year or 2 years or 3 years or all your life, I could ask, well, what do you think about working on something that you've had all your life and working on that by coming once a month or twice a month? What do you think about that? And they may very well turn to me and say, well, maybe that's not giving it enough time. I could ask them, well, if you're going to exercise, how many times a week would you recommend exercising for your health, physical health? If they say 3 times a week, well, why wouldn't maybe once a week be sufficient for you and your mental health? Because that's, you're exercising your mind, and it affects all your life, your work, your relationships with people, everything. So yes, I'm trying to talk somebody out of the idea that maybe once a month is, but if somebody wants to come once a month and that's the only way they can get into therapy, I could accept that. If I don't, they're not going to be in therapy, so how am I helping them at all? They might ask for about my profession. You might want to ask, what is your profession, Dr. Sehl? Are you a doctor? And I don't like to answer questions. I like to ask questions. So I like to say, well, is it important for me to be a doctor? What's important about that? Well, doctors are the best. Well, I might say, well, how do you know that? Like, what kind of a doctor? A physician? Yes, the physicians are best. Well, how do you know that? And she said, well, I just know that. And I said, well, have you ever seen physicians written up in the New York Times that they haven't been very helpful to their patients? And sometimes they neglect them or abuse them or overcharge them. But sometimes have you ever seen that? Of course they're going to say, yes, I've seen that in the paper, because it happens. So it doesn't mean that physicians are the best. Psychiatrists are the best, social workers not. You don't know. There's no way of knowing that. But I can ask the question, like, how many years have you been practicing, Dr. Sehl? Well, how many years would it take for me to be a good therapist for you? I mean, what is it going to be, 15 years, 10 years, 5 years? The only thing that's going to convince someone that you're going to be able to help them as a therapist is if they trust you by experience in working with you. Years are not going to do it. It might give some indication, but is it possible that a newcomer in therapy, somebody just got off the boat from China and was a journeyman in therapy, and a decent person, interested, passionate, but not have a journeyman? Is it possible that they could be better than an experienced therapist? I think it's so. Experience doesn't necessarily mean competency. What else could people ask? What would you want to know in terms of you coming to see a therapist? Think about it. But you're the consumer. You're going to be the one that's paying for the service. You're going to want to ask questions, and you're going to use your judgment and instinct. So for instance, if you ask a question of a therapist and they get defensive, not by asking a question about a question, I don't think that's defensiveness, but if they get defensive and make you feel you shouldn't ask questions, which doctors and physicians and therapists might often do. It's just like you're a child. You're not supposed to ask questions of the teacher. You're not supposed to ask your parents questions. No way. You want to be able to ask questions and feel free to speak. So, you're the boss. Remember that. It's your right to ask questions. And if a therapist doesn't want to respect that right, then that's a therapist that you don't want to be with. So I'm going to sign off for now. I think I've covered mostly everything that I have to cover. If you have any questions, you can also write in. If you like this channel, please press the like button, and that would help me know who's liking it and who's not, and that would help me be happy if you want to make me happy. And subscribe to the channel. Get a Gmail account if you want to. No videos are required. You can do that without any videos, and then you can write in and talk to me, and I answer back most of the questions that people write in. So thanks a lot for having the patience, listening to me, and as I usually say, without an audience I wouldn't have a channel here. So thanks a lot. Dr. Mark Sehl signing off for Therapy for the Heart.